we're going to have what might be a slightly more detail oriented stream this evening. And this is just going to be a very brutal slog through the DA's new procurement policy and their alternatives to BEE. What is their broader approach? Now, beforehand, we have to sort of sketch a bit of history and context to this. So, we know that from around 2012, just after the Marikana incident, Helen Zille May had a rather special interview at Chatham House. The one of the featured articles on our website is an article discussing the contents of this interview and some of the events and angles surrounding this. And this is in this interview, Helen Zille points out that the party should really want to implement the ANC's National Development Plan, and that they want to merge with the ANC, even if it's under Jacob Zuma, after Julius Malema's faction, who want radical economic transformation, has been ejected. So that latter ingredient happened very shortly afterwards in the formation of the EFF. And it's grown now that the MK has hived off and formed their own party. But the ANC remains largely unchanged, perhaps even a little radicalized. What the beg your pardon? What the I'm just going to drink some water here. Now, what the DA has done is after Musi Maimane, during which they tried to present a slightly tweaked version of BEE, and they tried to pitch black economic empowerment to the public in a slightly shinier package. So they weren't afraid to do the ANC's policies in very blatant fashion. But what they wanted to do was align it more with the United Nations goals, which at the time were heavily promoting what's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a certain brand of effectively race and gender based redistribution and allocation of resources by the state, very sort of central planning model. Another aspect of this is environmental control using carbon credits and other mechanisms. This is something that the DA still champions, and they've gone very hard for it under the new Climate Change Act, which they supported, which gives the minister complete power to set any targets for any kind of emissions, not just carbon, but any other chemical, across any sector, any region, or any individual company. Doesn't have to consult with anyone. It's just straight up centralized economic planning and so on. The DA likes this, but they also know that policies must be introduced incrementally, and so they're incrementally phasing in carbon controls. So that's part of that. What is interesting over here is that, and I'm going to share the screen now, the DA had a revised policy just after the. Why is this layout so terrible? Why is it doing that to me? I don't know why it's doing that to me. But anyway, this is how you've got to now look at the screen, because unfortunately Riverside doesn't show. No, I'm just a moron. There you go. See, I'm in a little bubble now in the corner. Now, what's happening over here is this is from 2018. So this is just before Musi Maimane was sort of done. It was just before he was supposed to be elected in a big landslide and so on. And it didn't happen. In fact, the DA's vote went down, and they had this big after action report and so on. But this sort of tells you, and it's a very short press statement. So I'm just going to read this. This is from the late James Self, who tried to get rid of Helen Zille out of the party, but he was to her left. And Gwen Ngwenyo, who is, she's now gone to work for some private company, but she was Helen Zille's protege. So this is a sort of, all of the factions of the party were aligned on this. So at the last Federal Council in July, the party discussed and considered a range of ideas of how we can grow the economy and broaden access to economic empowerment for those previously locked out of opportunities. So this is the idea of, we accept the philosophy behind Black economic empowerment, we just think it needs to be tweaked. And it's clear that the ANC's model has failed dismally. Okay, cool. We all know that. But why has it failed? What is their explanation? They don't really say. But what they do say is that, okay, well, we want to broaden economic inclusion, right? Not just in terms of race, but also gender and disability. So they want to go full woke, really, really hard. This was the Maimane area policy. So our goal is to advance the empowerment of disadvantaged South Africans, the majority of whom are Black. Okay, there we go. The painful legacy of apartheid persists in our society today. Yeah, we hear that from the ANC, so we don't need to hear it from you. And then they say they want to achieve a society where race is not a determinant of opportunity. Now, this is something that you'll see a lot in DA documents. They always talk about opportunity. Now, this is an interesting bit of fudge. Now, usually you can get this, there's this old debate that comes out of the American sphere where you talk about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. But if you're familiar with this, there's a novel called Harrison Bergeron. This is sort of like a very dystopian sci-fi thing written by, I think is it Nabokov who wrote Harrison Bergeron? Kurt Vonnegut, that's the one. So Kurt Vonnegut wrote it. And in Harrison Bergeron, the idea is you have a society where if you have any kind of physical skill or advantage, you have to be hobbled so that you aren't given any more opportunities than someone who might be blind, crippled, and mildly retarded. So they they fit you with glasses that that damage your vision. They put thingies in your ears so that you can't focus. Put all kinds of hobbles on your body, and it's basically what happens is if you try and look at equality of outcomes and equality of opportunities, if you have a society in which people are reaching different outcomes, it's because they have opportunities others do not have, like they have skills and so on and so forth, right? And some of those come from biology, like, okay, you're taller, more handsome, more intelligent, whatever. But then some of them come from environment. So you can say, well, actually, what we need to do is we need to control absolutely every factor and make sure that you can't inherit any advantages from your parents. Now, there are very few countries that really try to do this, even in communist societies. So, communist Romania did it a little bit with communal schooling, but that results in an incredibly dismal environment that's, the horrors that went on in the communal sort of dormitories and hostels there were, that makes pretty much anything that happened in this country seem tame. But the basic sort of thing that I want to get across here is when they talk about equality of opportunity, it's no different from any other kind of opportunity in terms of how the state's going to get involved. They're going to say, well, you're in a more difficult place, so you deserve a hand up. You're in a better place, you deserve to have stuff taken away from you. It's not very complicated. You have to give what you have back to society. And okay, fine. But this means you're controlling the direction of the economy. You're readjusting everyone's living standards according to, well, whatever. This principle of equality. Well, here we go. You can see where they're getting their stuff from. Immediately, it's about they go to the World Bank. Okay, the World Bank says it, therefore it must be correct. They propose a contributory pension, which will help provide them with more pension savings. Okay, so they want to privatize the pensions and make them accessible to both public and private investors. They have economic empowerment of the disadvantaged. All right. So that means that if you're running a procurement and you're a paraplegic, you're going to get ahead of the queue of someone who can walk, regardless of the quality of your business proposal or the services you provide. That's the idea. Pact for Inclusive Empowerment, Empowerment Index for listed and non-listed companies. So they want to develop a kind of BEE framework that's more mandatory, because there's this it's just going to increase the number of things that you have to register for your empowerment index. So that's what they had to begin with. So now we're going to move on to where we were a couple of years ago. I think in 2022. Let's just share the screen. And let's see, what are we? This guy. And once more, we have to visit the layout and force it to look normal. Now, this is a broad philosophical approach to, let's just go full screen with this guy so we can see it a little bit better. Go away, Acrobat. I don't need you. Right. So, and they talk about economic justice. Sustainable economic justice is a term that was invented by socialists in the late 20th century as a means of selling these ideas to people who didn't want socialism. And they have a sustainable development goal model. So the idea is to use the sort of progressive third way model of the United Nations, who the basic theory behind this is that you synthesize socialism and capitalism together to create this kind of new public-private partnership model of governing everything. Because if you create public-private partnerships, you can steer and control and command the private sector, right? Yeah, and then they have like a happy little thing of saying, okay, well, in 1976, the schools were moldy and trashy, and now they're sort of a bit grim, but better. And then in 2030, everyone's going to be learning to code and ready to make billions of dollars in the stock market or whatever. Yeah, and it's a fairly lengthy document, but it's worth paying attention to just how relentless the ideological content is and who they're selling this to. Because if you look at the average DA voter, you're not really moved by the idea of redistribution of wealth and all of that kind of stuff. So, but this is what they're trying to sell. So it remains to be seen exactly who they're selling these ideas to. But I mean, voters are not reading this. So they say an economically just society is one in which economic opportunities are available to all. So, I mean, this sounds very nice and fluffy, but what does it actually mean? Does it mean that literally any citizen putting in the same amount of effort is equally likely to become a millionaire? Really? I don't think anyone believes that, even in a fully communist society. So I don't really know how far they want to go with this, because what they're pushing here is not meritocracy. That isn't mentioned very much. It's mainly about adjusting the outcomes. And that is the one thing that they continuously describe. On the one hand, they sell you a slogan that says opportunity, and then what they describe in the policy is adjusting outcomes. So if we wish to create an inclusive and non-racial South Africa, we must address inequalities of opportunity. Yes. So poor governance, corruption, cadre deployment, race-based policies. Yes, we all agree with those. Those are very sensible. Now, what stands in the way of economic inclusion? Here we go. This is what I think is worth looking at. So they go, okay, a failed and corrupt state. Yes, we agree. Poverty. Poverty creates inequality of opportunity. So we're going to eradicate poverty. Great. But the things that they're doing here are not really things that are particularly geared to creating economic growth and, you know, development of the economy per se. It's more about making sure that anywhere that someone interacts with the state, they have to also do charity and some kind of um, adding a criterion that doesn't that isn't based on merit. So things aren't supposed to be efficient or better done. They're supposed to be, well, give someone else a chance. Okay. So then they go, okay, unemployment, we agree on this. Unemployment is bad, but this is very vague. Low duration of time spent in education. See, now this is a very sort of quantity versus quality issue. So you can spend all your way into matric and learn absolutely nothing. There are many people who graduate who can't read for meaning. So amount of time spent in education isn't really a good indicator. Wealth inequality caused by low savings and investments. So how do you actually get people to save and invest more? Well, you have to get inflation under control. That's not part of what's going here. Breakdown of the family. I mean, you see, these are weird things. So we know these are the case, but none of the DA's policies actually really fix these things because, broadly speaking, what they're trying to do is they take the ANC's policies and say, well, we're going to implement them better. There are some serious differences in terms of they don't want the sort of very strict, heavy-handed black economic empowerment regime. That's true, but regardless, they sort of see the same economic model. And here's a weird one. This one is really interesting. So they say that current policies mistakenly rely on trickle-down redress. Now, if you understand what they're doing here, it's an incredible little pretzel because trickle-down economics was Ronald Reagan, that if you grow the top, the bottom comes up with it. Now, that's actually that's conditionally true. So if manufacturing is growing, if you're having a highly diverse economy that's relatively self-reliant and onshored that's growing, then it does lift all boats. If your growth is concentrated in certain sectors, especially in extractive sectors like finance or resource extraction, you will get the wealth to be incredibly concentrated. So you really want sort of all of these value added industries that bring in people of different skill levels. That growth does raise all boats, and that does sort of trickle down. But mocking trickle down, or anyone who mentions trickle down, it was a widely mocked policy because Ronald Reagan's policies had mixed results. There were winners and losers, like in most economic systems. And so when someone talks about trickle down, they're signaling to people who hate free market policies and saying, yeah, we're with you. But specifically people who are university educated. There's a very interesting little signal here. So they're going trickle down bad, and then BEE is like trickle down racial redistribution policies. Really, really sort of funny little thing. So this is still the document from 2020, just to remind you. This isn't the present policy, which we're going to dive into in a minute. Now, they list now the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, they don't believe that the DA do not believe that South Africa is a unique country with unique challenges. They believe that all places in the world are fundamentally equal, all human beings are fungible, and a single centrally planned framework will meet all demands everywhere. Okay, there are no alternative ways of seeing life except in terms of these values here, right? And so they've set up a whole framework of targets. Now, the big ones over here would be like, climate action. So you've got all of your net zero suffocating nonsense over here, which is extremely bad and stupid. You've got the internationalization of fisheries policies, which is terrible because a couple of the big powers like flouting them, and you can't really do anything about that. So um, it's a bad deal for any small country to really follow these policies instead of just being really rigorously protectivist and applying strict quotas. Um, Now, the whole thing of reduced inequalities. I mean, like, the thing is, the more crippling your redistribution policies are, the better you're going to score here. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. If it hurts higher income groups, even if that induces a brain drain, this is good. Um, but like the thing is that a lot of these sort of seem very good on their face. I mean, like everyone's trying to reduce poverty, so that's meaningless. Zero hunger, everyone's trying to do that, so that's meaningless. Good health and well-being, everyone's trying to do that, so that's meaningless. But the specifics of how they want to do this is through aligning internal policies with the World Health Organization, a notoriously corrupt institution. Quality education, well, what is quality? Quality is basically the Bella Act. Bella Act is very much in line with the UN's preferences, where you have basically no meaningful discipline. You're just rubber stamping kids through. Um, and this extremely hyper liberal approach to schooling. Gender equality, also very silly. We shouldn't interfere with this at all. Um, if women want to do XYZ, they should be allowed to do it. If they can't outcompete men, we shouldn't be trying to force aside people who can do the job better. Clean water and sanitation, everyone's trying to do that, so it doesn't matter. So the thing is, the UN SDGs, as you'll notice with most of them, I mean, over this one, peace, justice, and strong institutions, there we go. Like, everybody needs to follow the exact same constitutional legal framework everywhere in the world. And partnership for the goals means other countries bully each other into compliance. So some of these things over here, okay, life on the land, we're going to centrally control agriculture. I forgot about that. But all of this amounts to a very, very silly thing, because some of them are like very obviously good, but the details are a problem. And one of the big things that they do is they score you. Some of the targets are, you're supposed to do as much work as possible with NGOs. Now, NGOs are time-wasting black holes which chow money and are also great vectors for unethical foreign influence of your government. And that's why they want you to do that, because it opens you up to foreign interference by mainly the United States and Europe. Corporate contributions to achieving the SDGs. Now, here's an important thing. When they talk about corporate contributions, what they're talking about is you create public-private partnerships through building contracts and policy alignment with major corporations. Small ones can be ignored. And by aligning these policies, you can get the private sector to implement your central planning doctrines without having to pass unpopular sections of this through law. You can create a system where, like in the United States, you have and Europe, you had a lot of these diversity, equity, and inclusion policies pushed through private enterprises where they train their own staff to believe certain doctrines and so on. So that's part of why this is, the corporate buy-in, stakeholder capitalism, all of this kind of stuff that people associate with the World Economic Forum, right? Now, some of them are nice here, like, a lean and capable state built on liberal democratic principles. Okay. But now, one of the things that was interesting over here is the establishment of an independent corruption fighting body. What they mean by independent was very interesting. A constitutional amendment that would create a committee selected from Parliament that would have an authority above the president and could subject anybody to investigation in a way that would, that could even force them to undergo a suspension. So you'd have a strange multi-party committee that could disrupt and supersede the authority of any part of the state. It's a very, very peculiar thing, right? It's very peculiar. Now, so the problem is that these things all sound very vague, and you have to know where the rubber hits the road. And I mean, this is really interesting over here. So they one of the ones they want to do is limiting teacher strikes during school hours, and like all of these little goals that some of them are sensible, some of them are very sensible, but some of this is like just empty signaling. The whole school approach, it's you'll see this phrase in the next document. They'll use the phrase whole of society approach. Now this came from the Millennial Development Goals. So yeah, one of the big problems here is they want to improve levels of financial literacy. I don't see how they're going to do that. Here we go, employee share ownership. Okay. So the idea is that you create a society in which you, now what I find very interesting is that we've tried very radical forms of this, where you have, there was a guy called Solms. I think he's a neuroscientist. He was at the University of Cape Town, but he bought a farm outside Stellenbosch, I think, and he shared about half of his shares, although just shy of a controlling share, with the workers on the farm. And this went really badly. He tried to include them in governance because they had enough of a share to be included in governance decisions. Everything went badly, and people were trading their shares with each other, trying to, there were a lot of things that went wrong, and there's writing on this. But, employee share ownership only goes so far, and you run into the same problem in that if you really want people to participate, you've got to prevent them from selling their shares, because there's only a certain class of person who will actually hold on to their shares as an investment or be a wise contributor to the governing of a company. Everyone knows you can't run a company as a democracy. It doesn't work. In fact, we know countries can't be run as a democracy either, but we have to, and the way we get around this is we make the democracy entirely hollow, and anytime it comes up that people object to something, we call it populism, and use the power of the state to break up their political representation opportunities. So that's how liberal democracy works in practice. The thing is, a lot of these items are fairly decent common sense. It's that, and so it depends on which ones you really want to, which ones you really think are being leaned on and how. So lowering the barriers to entry for accessing investment products. But what does that mean? Does that mean less paperwork, or does that mean loans should be easier to access? Explore tax relief for households with adult dependents. Well, what you're doing is you're kind of incentivizing parasitism in a way. You're creating economic incentives, I mean, look, this is not necessarily how it turns out. The results are always mixed on the ground, and there are a lot of people who justly would benefit from this. But as usual, there are a lot of unintended consequences of when these things are introduced at scale. Some things that most people would like are shared parental leave and so on, and enforcing maintenance payments and so on. Reducing teenage and unwanted pregnancies. Now that's an interesting one. You maximize the amount of abortions and you encourage people to undertake them. I don't very much care for that. But one of the interesting things over here is that reducing promiscuity isn't on the list. So trying to get people to hold marriages together, that's not on the list. It's like, well, the sexuality side of maintaining a family balance, family cohesion, that's not part of it. And that's actually the core feature of what makes families function, is fidelity and chastity and all of those things, which seem incredibly old-fashioned nowadays. So universal healthcare subsidies. So this is the interesting thing, and I think this is why the DA was so reluctant to attack the NHI until it was kind of too late, is that they already have a mandate to go after this themselves, right, in some form. Child nutrition, my goodness. So yeah, no, everyone knows that's something you've got to do something about. But best way to do this is actually get the economy functioning. And the things that work there have been known for a million years. All of this kind of weird hyper focus on odd little details, revolving mainly around equality and redistribution of resources, is largely a distraction from what is required to actually produce a functioning society at scale. So the Chinese don't go into all of this kind of stuff in the same way. What they'll do is they'll focus on, China and the East Asian economies, they're the most advanced and functioning societies that we have right now. And when you look at how they break down their goals for reducing, they don't go into all of this weird stuff. What they do is they say, okay, well, this sector needs development and we need these skills, and these sectors create economic opportunities, so we're going to boost them. So here we can see that they're kind of they don't have their eye on the ball. What the UN is doing is they're doing things that break down the distinction between public and private. They're increasing dependency of individuals on the state, and they're breaking down social institutions that have traditional basis. So things like extended family, tribe, ethnicity, religion, what have you. The idea is that all of this has to go away, and it mostly is gone now anyway, right? We're mostly atomized individuals anyhow. But so that the only relationship you have as a person is with the state, right? And when you're in that point, everything becomes about politics, but then your options are shut down so that you can only pick from like a short list of policies, because your country is supposed to adhere to the social development goals exclusively. So you can't have a Chinese style thing unless you make yourself a Chinese vassal. It's an unfortunate position. So they have current legislation, then there's the usual thing of, so most of this is just expanding, most of the rest of this is just expanding on the kind of stuff that they looked at before, right? And that's the broader policy document. But now we get to the important bit, which is our whatchamacallit over here, the Public Procurement Amendment Bill. Now, the Public Procurement Amendment Bill is the main one that we're going to be concerning ourselves with now. Okay, and let me see if I can just get rid of some of this bump so that we can read a bit better. This is actually a fairly reasonable document, it has to be said. Now, but it's interesting what they're focusing on. It's sometimes interesting when you read a DA document, what they focus on. You remember when you were reading the other documents, they consistently focus on these like post-apartheid stuff and so on. So over here, they talk about how black eradicated poverty amongst black people. Right? That's the only thing they're worried about, really. And I mean, anyone could tell you this, but just before the elections, we have that. There's a study that I've discussed before by Atlas Intelligence, which is a Brazilian company, and they analyzed the attitudes to black economic empowerment and all of this kind of stuff. Expropriation without compensation still had the outright support of about 54, 55%, if I remember correctly, of the population. Then you got 15% undecided on top of that. So, and it was more popular than expropriation with compensation. And BEE has a big majority support as well. So what we're really looking at over here is a country where, despite the criticism, which I think everyone understands, I think even very poor people understand this, but it generally has support because there's this understanding that, well, it's our turn, not your turn, and people still think in those terms. So the arguments that the DALA are not to the voter. This argument is for a certain kind of person who will be a professional, because these documents will be cues for how to market this. The two guys that they got to do interviews are Cuthbert and what's the other fellow's name? I can't remember. But so they got two sort of less recognizable DA members, one of whom was involved in drafting this bill, to discuss this on BizNews. And they didn't say anything particularly impactful or important, and didn't seem all that enthusiastic about the bill, because, I think the thing is, they know, first and foremost, that there's no way this bill's going to pass. The DA has introduced 50 private members' bills, and every time they do that, they pay a couple million rand in consultants' fees. So these bills go into Parliament on the floor, they get tabled, and they get defeated. All of them. 50 private members' bills, or whatever it is. It's roughly that number, although I couldn't really count all of them. And we don't have any evidence that this is anything more than fluff. But what fluff they are tells you a little bit about the party. It tells you what their ideas are. Now, what they're saying is economic inclusion for all, same thing as previous. We are implementing the bill seeks to reform the framework by aligning it with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Right? But why not just repeal BEE entirely? Why not just repeal it and then make all public procurement by, value for money alone? There's no reason not to do that. What they're trying to do is they're saying that we want to get all of the private companies in the country to align their policies with the United Nations. And nobody votes for the United Nations. No one sits here and says, well, we actually want a global government. The DA is trying to say, look, global government is always sensible. Therefore, we should always be aligned with the global government. Global government's kind of weak now, but, the more you feed it, the more you implement it, the more real it becomes. So DA are trying to implement global government in South Africa here. And the way they're doing this is this little 80-20 calculation where, 80% is value for money, but you have to also have this economic inclusion, social development goals impact score. And one of the things over here to note is that they could do this without passing any laws by implementing it where they govern. There's a case in 2022, Sakaliga won this case. They got a ruling from Judge Zondo, which said something very interesting. There's no constitutional mandate to include BEE in procurement policy, but there is a constitutional mandate to pursue value for money. And so the existing interpretation of the law and the Constitution by the Constitutional Court in South Africa is that value for money comes first, and only after that's been considered are you mandated to look at BEE. The DA has not taken advantage of this at all. They're not interested. They refuse to. They want everything to flow through the political center, and they only ever check the ANC on procedural issues. So, for example, when that VAT dispute was happening earlier this year, they did something that they could have done whether they were in opposition or not. They didn't have to be part of the GNU to block the ANC's VAT program, and the ANC increased VAT, didn't put their VAT increases. But what was interesting is watching how the DA negotiated, because until they noticed that the legislative process wasn't properly followed, what they did is they offered an alternative way to gather the money. And that alternative way is, okay, well, we don't increase VAT, but we increase the fuel levies and we start taxing people's medical aids. Like, the insanity over here is beyond belief, because, fuel levies impacts absolutely every good and service in the country. So it's equivalent to doing VAT in terms of its broader impact. And the other angle of this is taxing people's medical aid. I mean, it's just insane. And then they found a way of saving, I think, something piddling like 16 billion rand, which is a lot of money to any one person, but is nothing at the scale of the whole country. They found a way to save, I think, 16 billion rand from various departments by trimming tiny little bits here and there. And this was the way that they bargained for it until they noticed there was a procedural error that could allow them to get the budget cancelled, so that the ANC would have to try again. So the DA have a very weird way of approaching these kinds of problems. And with BEE, we have exactly the same problem. They have actually a legal mandate and a political mandate to go ahead and just say, well, wherever we govern, BEE will only be considered if all other qualities are equal, right? So it's about prioritizing different criteria. What they do here is that they remove priority, right? And they do simultaneous evaluation with different weightings. That means that there is no situation in which social development goals are not part of the calculation, which means that all companies now have to implement social development goal planning in their private companies. This is what they want to do, and it's an enormously complex policy framework. Very expensive to implement and evaluate if you're any kind of company, right? This is going to make it very difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to go for tenders, right? Because it's going to be bloody expensive. Consultants are going to make an absolute killing, right? Because BEE is simple, right? You count the amount of workers you have, you look at the color of their skin, you look at the shape of their genitals, and then you go, okay, we've got so many of these categories, here's the score. It's, owners and employees, right? So that gets you your BEE score. It can be expensive, thousands of rands, but that's not a huge ask. Anyone who can read an Excel spreadsheet can do you that. Social development goals, woof, dude. That's ages. Gearing up to keep that score and updating it is hard work, very, very time consuming. So, it's actually worse, because think about what happens when you look at this little table is it's only 20% of the weight. Yes, but now everyone has got to, if they want to sort of be competitive in the bidding process, they have to go and implement social development goals. Now, this is assuming it can pass, which it absolutely can't, because it's a DA private members bill. DA never ever pass any legislation. No one ever goes on. And in fact, Jacob Zuma said, yeah, we're not voting for that. Have fun. So this is about an intellectual exercise, understanding where the DA is at and what they're offering. And what they're offering is infinitely expanding bureaucracy, constantly increasing taxes and levies all the time, foolish and unsustainable policies across the board. My example obviously be Cape Town, where they've increased the black population through incentivizing land invasions primarily by 240%. Something like what is it called? Non-black residents of Cape Town are about to become a minority if they're not already. And yeah, no, it's really, really miserable situation because these people broadly are very low income. So what it means is that they're dependent on the state to provide them with all the basic services, and they don't pay any taxes back. And most of your taxes go to the national government anyway, right? So I think only 3% comes back in terms of government services from at the municipal level, and the rest is supposedly national services. Although I'm not sure what's being delivered there. Now, even with the DA's sort of really, kind of harebrained schemes, if Cape Town itself was a self-contained government that collected the taxes of its own citizens at the rates that currently exist, the kind of services they'd be able to deliver would be radically different, far deeper, and far more transformative. But Jordan Hill-Lewis has point blank refused, and the party has refused, to renegotiate the Division of Revenue Act. That's weird. Why would you not want more money that your own citizens have paid tax on? It's very weird. Of course, his answer in private to some people is like, well, okay, well, Buffalo City needs the money. And I think, okay, well, that's a great idea, but Buffalo City is basically a perforated bucket. You're just pouring water through a sieve. I mean, look, the thing with the DA is they've got so many things in which are just common sense and whatever, but this is low-hanging fruit that anyone who is not completely out of their tree could come up with. Like, here we go. Anyone who's an actual criminal shouldn't be allowed to contract with the government. Well, gee willikers. I mean, not doing business with criminals. That's a radical idea. I mean, look, sure it is. The ANC, everyone in that party is a criminal. Everyone who's ever been in that party is a criminal. Anyone who's ever supported that party, more or less. It's just dismal. And as carried away as I'm getting with this, it's, we know that the DA are not as corrupt as the ANC, sure. But we also know that people vote according to race. Only 4% of the black population vote for the DA, except in Johannesburg, where it's, I think, just over 10%. This is not, I don't know, Joburg's always been that way. That's not like a new thing that's an emerging trend. It's sort of black population in Joburg are actually far less racialist than the rest of the country. And the Western Cape is the most racist, or should I say racialistic? I don't know what the right word is in this case anymore. Black voting population. I think their vote for the DA in the Western Cape is at 1 or 2%, somewhere around there. And they tend not to vote at all, actually. So this procurement bill over here, here we go, and it's this really weird thing where we've got some nice sort of we've got these very fair blank slate sort of positions, but this is very weird. So job creation, skill development, and enterprise support in low-income communities. So now what they're doing is they're saying, well, somehow they're going to find a way to create a score where what your company does for the government, right, has to be scored based on how it benefits poor people. But it's unclear what that actually means at the implementation level. So now one of the things that they've promoted is, well, you can do some beneficiation stuff, like you can build creches and you can donate money to NGOs. Ha, 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 ha. So, that one I find always very shifty. But, here we go. Direct measurable contributions to national development objectives. So, the ANC's latest 5-year plan. Yeah. I mean, if you put money into the government's coffers and implement their policies for them, then you are going to be promoted above other companies. This is kind of broadly speaking what you see over here. I like that they did. It's obviously a good thing that they're replacing race as the primary criterion. But one of the things about social development goals is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of it, right? So race, sex, and ability are part of the calculation. It's part of the calculation. Yeah, here we go. Human development, economic empowerment. I mean, hiring local small businesses. I like the idea, but what you tend to get is you get like this little captured network that happens. I mean, this is not something that any bill can really solve. I'm just sort of, for this particular point, I'm just pointing out something that's just a hard problem. You tend to get these entrenched local patronage networks because it's obviously a good thing to hire companies that are local, like within your own municipality or district or province or whatever, over national oligarchies. And frankly, I would be doing that, adding that as a criterion too. But you do tend to foster local corruption over time as you do this, because local markets tend to be crowded, claustrophobic. I don't like the environmental sustainability thing because, okay, look, renewable energy projects, okay, but not really. I mean, one of they've absolutely, gone bananas here in Drakenstein by having one of the largest waste to energy projects ever, and this thing has been dragging on for more than a decade now. And I found a UCT study that quoted the company that pitched the tender, and they had quoted the municipality 200 million rand, but the municipality were quoting the public 1.2 billion. So the other thing that they did is, in order to make sure that there was enough garbage to serve such a massive waste to energy plant, which is completely unnecessary, they banned the removal of any waste from the municipality. So you can't get garbage out of Drakenstein. You will get fined for it. The other thing they did, which is really sneaky and subtle, is, so if you're building a what do you call it, like a landfill site, you need rubble in order to compact the garbage. So building rubble is generally free. But what they did is they added they added a really hard penalty for any tiles found inside building rubble. There's absolutely no reason for doing this, right? But what it does is that if you're not careful in how you sift your building rubble, they can fine you. So people are getting reluctant to send their building rubble to the landfill, which means they find it hard to compact the landfill. And you also get more fly tipping. So this creates a lot of problems. You also don't have enough, they wouldn't build any new landfill sites, even though they were necessary. Because, same reasons, they're trying to make sure that there's supply there so that it's a viable project. So you get all of these strange unintended consequences of trying to drive for these ridiculous targets. There's no reason to do a waste to energy plant. It's inefficient. It creates horrible pollution. I mean, sustainable development, absolutely killing me here. I mean, one of the things on their environmental impact report, which they did for 200, it was 20 million rand. Some guy charged to write the environmental impact development for this plant. And the guy actually, he fudged so many things. He didn't look at the local wind conditions in Paarl, Wellington area. So what happens in Wellington is, and most people who live in Wellington know about this because of the old tannery. It's shut down a while ago, but it was the longest running and oldest factory in South Africa. And they were a tanning factory, which means you get this horrific smell of rotting eggs that wafts over the town. It doesn't anymore. It smells like office buildings and little cafes and stuff. But when it was in operation, you get this horrendous cloud wafting over the town. And it settles there because the air is very still and gets trapped in this valley. And they didn't look at this as a factor. They said, well, okay, wind will just blow it away. So the entire, um, concern is invalid. And then they didn't do the health impact of particles below a certain size. So it was very, very, biased study. This got torn apart and they promised to get rid of it. And then the very same day they promised to get rid of this project, they go to Barbara Creasy in the national government for a grant and put the thing back on track. And then they try and smuggle it in under another development project for upgrading the water treatment facility, because they are going to have to share water resources, these two projects. So it's just this kind of stuff over and over again. You or twice, and like the background that goes into um turbines and solar panels, and how often they expire and so on. The Lazards per unit levelized per unit cost of energy, there's a lot of flubs and sort of crooked ways that they record that. So they record the impact for the whole production chain for the products that are carbon based, but they only record part of the value chain that produces solar panels and wind energy, because those are the ones they want to promote. And then those create an excessive burden on the grid because they are highly variable, which means that your grid capacity has to be much, much higher. And then you've got storage technology, which just it goes on and on. So there's like all of these weird externalities. Now, don't get me wrong. I think, solar panels and wind farms and everything have their place, and it's good to see them go up here and there. But you can't base your whole strategy on these things, if you're working at a national level, then go for nuclear. You don't see what the problem is. And if you're opening up to private investment, go nuclear. It's like, that's the way to go. And I'm very glad that the government's currently opening a second project near Coburg. I think that's great. But that's not a DA policy at all. So the NC's B. Okay, here they go. Oh wow, we're better than them. They're race-based. We're focused on instituting global governance policies inside every private company. So fuck. I mean, they're not even going to in this document. They don't even discuss thresholds. So it's like anyone who does business with the government, like, you're going to have to impose this SDG stuff on you. It's actually kind of nasty and draconian in its own way, because there's not this priority thing. It's not like you can opt out of it the way that you could remember the alternative option that I said, where you just look at Raymond Zondo's ruling on the relative constitutionality of the value for money criterion versus the BEE criterion in procurement. And you can basically just hire non-BEE companies for a tender. You can award them a tender on the basis that, well, they've got value for money. Sorry, guy, that's constitutionally mandated. This isn't. This takes priority. This was a constitutional court ruling, and I mean, the thing is, they don't even want to test it. They don't even want to try and test it. They're willing to spaff money on any and all kind of obstacles to their own policies. But the second that it comes up that they have to do something that their actual voters want, they're like, yeah, but you're not really part of the process, are you? And here's what I find incredibly funny. So this one is, the BEE has rigid compliance checklists and ownership restructuring. And this one is, we don't have rigid compliance checklists. We have operational excellence. And we don't have ownership restructuring. We have social investment. That is like, I don't know. And then they go, you get fronting practices and elite enrichment. Okay, but remember what I just described with the waste to energy plant. Like, no prosecutors touching this. No one cares. And the people who complained were removed off committees and stuff like that. So the DA doesn't listen to dissidents. I mean, you ask anyone who's at a low level or even a mid level in the DA, no one will listen to any disagreements on policy. No one will listen to any comments on, can it get done? Is it a good idea? No. You can be a bit of a policy wonk, and you can fine tune what's been handed down to you, but you have no room for disagreeing. There's none whatsoever. And they really don't like it. They run a very tight ship. And in fact, the DA's constitution actually forbids its members from disagreeing with any of their policies under any conditions. This is not something that is imposed on members of, say, the Democratic Party in the United States or the Republican Party or any of the parties in the UK or most of the German parties, right? The DA are very strict about this. No dissent whatsoever will be tolerated once a policy has been adopted. And the policy formation process is very behind closed doors. Tends to be drafted by one or two people who are picked by the senior committees, by the FedEx and so on. So, yeah, I really can't tell you that I'm very inspired by this. I mean, look, you've got, when they talk about fronting practices and elite enrichment, there are alternatives to say, well, actually, we should empower foreigners who never once looked at our country to set the targets that we use to govern everything down to the mom and pop stores. It's, like if you've got a lighting supply company and you just want to fix, fit fluorescent light bulbs into the, municipal offices, you now have to produce like this giant stack of paper that says how you align with all of these microscopic goals within the UN development. I mean, like, can you imagine the kind of stuff? You look at your sort of like local supplier in, I don't know, Langeberg or, Mosselbaai or whatever. And the guy's sort of like, he drives his bucky, he's got his 3 or 4 employees, he's got a warehouse, he can store a bunch of stuff in. Regular, normal world where stuff makes sense, he'd apply for a tender and say, yeah, I supply light bulbs. I'm good at supplying them. I can fit them really quickly. My guys are super top notch. Check out all my clients. They say, yeah. And he goes and does it. Right? But now what he has to do is he has to produce this like fat stack of like, well, how environmentally friendly are we, and how much carbon are we saving, and how many women did we employ, and how many women did we give shares to, how many disabled people in the company, and like, I mean, just the bananas stuff. And like, oh yeah, and how did you give back to the community? But careful, don't give back to the community in the wrong way. We want things that align with the national economic plan. So what they're doing is they're saying that, okay, in order to do business with a state, you've got to implement their policies in the private sector. It's not about actually solving the problem. It's about having a totalitarian system where public and private sector are completely aligned, right? And the DA really, really loves this. They hate the free market. They really do. They're like private companies. And there's a good reason behind this. The thinking that comes out of this sort of like Fabian society that produced the basic ideological framework that became the UN Sustainable Development Goals is this third way stuff. Big with Thabo Mbeki, big with Tony Blair, big with Bill Clinton. Like, a lot of this was stuff like that says, well, okay, look, we want the wealth redistribution and the central planning that the Soviet Union had. But we also want to have the quality control and budgetary discipline of the private sector and innovation of the private sector in the West. So how can we do both? And the thing is, you kind of end up with neither, because if you have a system where everything's based on public-private partnerships, you develop a cronyist system. So now, in the Eastern countries, you get a lot of that. So in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, when they developed, they picked a small select group of companies that had close personal ties to the ruling party. but they grew in this very sort of disciplined way, unrestrained by problems with labor and so on. What you have instead is this now is the system where, okay, well, you have public-private partnerships. They're locked into government contracts. It's not about growing industries. It's about making sure that everyone's locked into the government system. So the budgetary discipline becomes kind of a fudge. You can do a bit of that, but what you're loading onto the back end of this an enormous welfare state that's never allowed to shrink. And then you've got open borders and you've got all of these kind of problems. So there's all of these kind of like weird ways in which eventually knowing whether the outcome's actually good or bad becomes blurry. And because everyone's doing it, it's hard to tell to what extent that it's actually doing any good. And I tried to find like economic papers that were looking into this, and it's almost dead 50-50, positive and negative. And about a third of them say that there's no meaningful correlation between economic growth and compliance with SDGs. So it seems to me that it's like no one knows if these things are actually doing any good. We just know that they're creating a lot of time wasting. They're creating a lot of corrupt relationships between public and private sectors. And there's not just here, like across Europe and America. They're making everything more bureaucratic, everything more complicated. They're reducing meritocracy. And it's just this red tape bonanza where there's no reason for it. It's just very stupid, very time wasting, and it makes a lot of jobs for a lot of very stupid people. But one of the big things it also does is it massively empowers and funds NGOs, because it gets everyone to redirect their funds to NGOs. And NGOs are an enormous vector. This is why they're a big part of like the open society, this idea that is very, very strongly backed by the DA. Remember, Helen Zille worked for them with the Open Society Foundation for 13 years. But part of being an open society is to allow vectors for foreign influence for the reform of your country. And that's what the NGOs come in, because bribing your politicians is frowned upon. But if you dump money into an NGO who can then interface with your politicians, write their policies for them, that's much better. Now, the UK short circuits this. The UK system works like this. The civil servants pay an NGO to write a policy that's adopted by the members of parliament. Members of parliament do nothing. They're mainly just a rubber stamp. And the prime minister the prime minister and the whip that manage the parties are steered by the intelligence services and various other ministries. The ministers do not have power to hire and fire in their own departments. They're kind of overseen. They're mainly figureheads who just read out reports in public. So you've got the United Kingdom doesn't have a democracy. You can't influence public policy very much unless you've got enormous willpower. Foreign policy you can't touch because the intelligence services will get rid of you, like they did with Jeremy Corbyn. And here in South Africa, well, no one can do anything because populism over here is so big that there's only so much room for actual global governance. And this is where the DA comes in. The idea is that the DA will get in, and by being as much like the ANC as they possibly can, they'll get the ANC to work with them. And then they'll get rid of some of the like more troubling policies of the ANC that rock the boat and make people feel insecure. And they'll get to implement this kind of like heavily bureaucratic global governance schemes. Now, part of these global governance schemes that the DA are very keen on is digitization. So Dean McPherson recently went up to Chatham House, which is a Fabian Society organization. They have I'll do another stream on this at some other point about those particular organizations and their history and their branches and their influence in South Africa. But Dean McPherson goes up there and he gets 10 million rand deal with the UK government to help digitize his department. It doesn't look like much, and it's kind of cheap on the scale of government. But what it is everything gets digitized. And a lot of that's very good. It does streamline things if it's done well. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's part of an obsession. So Leon Schreiber, who's obsessed with Fabian policies, and he's big on the third way. He thinks that every country should be, every mid-market country should be run like Brazil, particularly Lula da Silva's Brazil, which incentivizes land invasions, legalizes land invasions effectively, universal basic income, persecution of right-wing populists, and of course the most fabulous corruption anywhere in Latin America. In fact, when Lula da Silva is in the running for the most corrupt politician in the world, but this is the guy that they like. Corruption's not really an issue for these people. They know that voters don't like it, but they're completely okay with it as long as the corruption is not being done by people they don't like. So, what Schreiber does in his adulation of Tony Blair and Lula da Silva and this kind of weird third way stuff, and particularly its more redistributive side, is that Tony Blair and the Tony Blair Institute and all of these governments and the international banking system, specifically the Bank of International Settlements, there's like a cluster of these organizations that are pushing for a particular digitalization model. And this digitalization model works with central bank digital currencies. Now, central bank digital currencies, the way it was justified to most of the financial sector was through a theory called modern monetary theory. And this is basically just like, well, you have one committee and one organization that controls the liquid property of every single person or organization in society. They can force you to spend it by imposing expiry dates on your own money. They can control what you can and can't spend your money on. So you can buy this product, but not this product. So you can ban meat and you can ban certain kinds of cars. You can ban, you can ban whatever the hell you like. You can promote whatever the hell you like. You can make sure that your nephew's new tech company is the only way that you can buy, USB cables or whatever the hell. It doesn't matter, right? And it means anywhere, and you can delete money. You can delete it anywhere. So if inflation gets out of control, the proposed solution is you just delete people's savings. And the idea is to hold society in place and permanently control it in any way you like. But in order to have CBDCs work, you have to have digital ID. So digital ID is going to link your bank account and your social media presence as well, because you're going to have that, with your tax compliance, the whole 9 yards. And you got to wonder what the point of tax compliance is in the first place in this kind of system, which is why MMT is the big feature. So the idea is that the Bank of International Settlements will set financial targets, and the central banks in every country that is a member of this group will comply. And there's nothing that anyone can do, because if you don't agree with this, you don't get it implemented, you will be sanctioned. Your economy will be destroyed by illicit means. The Bank of International Settlement is beholden to no state. It has the powers of a state. The Swiss police can't even enter their premises without permission, and they run their own sort of internal police service. They don't have to be transparent about anything in their bank accounts, whatever. So it's this weird little organization that basically runs the central banking systems across the world. And Leon Schreiber is very eager to make sure that this policy is implemented in South Africa. The way he's doing it in cooperation with Edward Kieswetter of SARS is that they are bringing in the private banks, well, the big ones anyway, the big five and plus Capitec. And Capitec has supported, was kickstarted by a $50 million grant from USAID, which is an organization used as a slush fund for the CIA. And they bankrolled the DA for a very long time. And the head of Capitec has also not only been a big donor to the DA, but Michel Leroux's actually participated in writing sort of policy documents, like the 2019 review of what's it called, the electoral performance. Now, Leon Schreiber and Edward Kieswetter's new policy frameworks include employing AI to track people's tax behavior, certain targeted focuses, and so on and so forth. But it also involves the privatization of the Department of Home Affairs in preparation for digital ID, which they're going to implement. It's going to happen. Tony Blair's been trying to get this done in the UK since he came to power in '97. It's been sort of a thing on the back burner. This stuff. I mean, they tested it out in Afghanistan when they were in charge there. It's like there's this really crazy compulsion for it to try and drive it everywhere. At the same time, they've been cracking down on spaza shops. There was an excuse to do this with what's it called? A few cases of food poisoning that were had. But they're not cracking down on like immigrant businesses with Hawala and Fei Chan, which are these sort of untraceable money systems that are used by Pakistanis and Chinese. So they don't crack down on those kind of systems at all, but they crack down on like these tiny little locally owned spaza shops that are operating in cash. And the reason for this is that you want to abolish cash. You want to move people over to digital platforms. Once they're in digital platforms, they're plugged into the banking system directly and everything can be monitored. You can track their tax payments and all that. It's great. It's very, very good for implementation. But the downside for most people is that, once central bank digital currencies become implementable, likely sometime in the next decade, you're going to run into some problems because debanking is a problem. If the government doesn't like who you are, they can have the private banks remove your access to the economy. And there's just nothing you can do about it because there will not be any evidence that they were involved in the decision. This has happened several times in the UK. And when it finally happened to Nigel Farage, they got to make a legal precedent against it. But, not everyone's going to be so lucky. A lot of people have been debanked. And not all of them are prominent enough to do anything about it. So yeah, it's we're heading for a very, very scary world. And I mean, people who think Bitcoin's the answer, unless you can create an entirely Bitcoin operable economy, you're going to struggle. And the problem with that is that there has to be an on-ramp and an off-ramp in Bitcoin to do business with the broader economy. Yeah. And I mean, I suspect that there are developments in that world that might be positive. And I mean, part of me is very optimistic about it. But the other part of me sort of thinks there's something like there's something coming, because the idea that states are going to let this untouched, and the idea that Bitcoin is entirely inviolable, those premises don't make sense to me. And I think, look, for now it's great. I'm glad there's something like this out there. But at the same time, I have this sort of gnawing suspicion that all the angles have yet to be covered. So I'm going to stop with that screen nonsense. Okay, now we can just look at my silly, ugly mug. Now I'm just going to read your comments. So, Johan, not sure who you are, bud, but hello and hi. Interesting choice of time for a live stream. I've got to do it sometime, and I wanted to get it out of the way. Dagbreker, nice to see you from Twitter. Yeah, the Tocqueville warns about this, and now people are using the two-pot system to gamble. Yeah, but we knew about that, and it's encouraged. No one wants anyone to have savings. I mean, that's ludicrous. Government can't tax savings like that. People would run screaming. They'd hide the money under their bed. Lobram Takati, I recognize you as well. DA's Club of Davos. That's why they work with Ramaphosa. No, I think the reason they work with Ramaphosa is because they have to. And Ramaphosa makes peace with foreigners because he has to. The more I read about them, the more I realize that he does actually believe in all of this stuff, and he's been the big driver of BEE the whole time. He was the main partner in the 90s. He was the main drafter in the 2000s. And he's really pushed it hard since he's come to the presidency. So he's the main guy there. And, you know, the Oppenheimers tried to include them in their little think tank back in the 70s and 80s. And he, at a certain point, he just sort of quit, like halfway through his degree, and said, no, he's not going to do that anymore. And he went to go and pressurize the mines to give them more trouble. And I don't think Ramaphosa has actually kind of captured part of this. Mbeki buys into it a lot. Zuma doesn't buy into it at all, and he thinks all of this stuff is a joke, which, you know, it's fun. It in a way is kind of entertaining, but it's quite real. And yeah, no, I think Ramaphosa is actually fairly serious about the ANC's program. And I think that the DA are forced to work with him in the same way that 10 years ago they'd have been forced to work with the Zuma's ANC. And again, that interview with Chatham House with Helen Zille, where she says, you know, we're willing to work with anyone so long as they'll let us, you know, implement the National Development Plan. You know, we want to test it here in the Western Cape, you know, that kind of thing. And the idea is that you sort of like draw a cordon sanitaire around the serious black nationalists, and then you have the soft black nationalists and the minoritarian progressives in the same camp, forming an effective one-party state. And then you can raise the electoral thresholds so that you have a permanent bipartisan cartel over here, and then you have black nationalists on the outside who can't get in, and then you starve them of donations. This is kind of like the thinking behind a lot of this kind of stuff, from my interpretation. And I mean, it's very clever, but you know, nobody controls everything, so you can't really get all of this. And we have an imperfect version of it right now, which is not working out as planned. And again, it's one of those things where you, just because you see see something that's conspiratorial in nature doesn't mean it's going to be quite like that, or it's going to work out quite that way. And we don't know exactly in which ways what aspects will fail, and everything fails to some degree. So and there's always chinks in the armor, but again, not everyone's got a spear to poke in that chink. So one of the things that you're going to notice here is, again, that Zondo ruling from 1922. What am I talking about? 2022. That's quite a landmark victory, and it's like very small and undramatic sounding, but it has enormous impact, because that whole thing of priority, where you go, okay, value for money, roughly equal. Oh, now we're going to look at BEE scores. How many different cases you have of companies that are so clearly superior in the value for money they offer that, you know, a BEE can't compete or whatever. It won't be every time, but it'll be enough of the time that it's noticeable, right? And this is the main link in the chain that is our main problem, which is that public procurement requires BEE scores to do any business with the state, and the state is a third of the economy. And in order to get those BEE scores, your own contractors have to also be BEE compliant. So it's like this chain reaction. In order to do business with any company that does business with the state, you have to be BEE compliant. That's not a third of the economy. That's the vast majority of the economy that is now impacted by this decision through a single implementation point. If you want to undo all of BEE overnight, all you have to do is test that case that Zondo ruled on in 22. But the DA don't want to do that. They want to make a gesture towards a really draconian, stupid social development goals plan. And they want to then go and say, yeah, well, we're also going to go about this in the least effective way possible, which is a private member's bill in Parliament, which will never, ever pass. So what are you doing? There's nothing there. By the way, interesting comment here from Lowbrow, and he's quoting Benito Mussolini. He said, "Are we getting fascism without the cool aesthetics?" Right? Now, what's very interesting about this is there are a couple of conversations that were happening around this time in the interwar period in Europe. And one of them is, now I've mentioned the Fabian Society, and they're very influential in this key pivotal time around the 90s when the Soviet Union's going down and global, sort of the global institutions set up by the United States in the post-war period are entering this hegemonic period where they've got to readjust and reestablish their mandate. And it's the Fabians who step into the fore with public-private partnerships, whole of society approach, blurring the distinctions between national, international, public-private, different branches of government, all of this, and the big NGO stuff. Although this is partially the influence of the intelligence community, and that's a whole hairy other can of worms. But there's a conversation on Maynard Keynes. Everyone knows John Maynard Keynes is this is the precursor to MMT, and MMT is based on Keynesian economic principles, right? He was a member of the Fabian Society. I mean, he was also a child molester, but that's a different story. I mean, should I say, a frequenter of child brothels. But anyway, so what the Fabian pederast got up to is, MMT is often sort of referred to in some ways as neo-Keynesianism. So this is what was interesting is that he had this discussion with he had this discussion with Mosley. What's Mosley's first name? The leader of the British Union of Fascists, right? And Mosley says to him, like, I love everything you're doing. We think exactly the same. Right? Now, Keynes is horrified because Keynes has this sort of like globalized, integrated, non-racialist vision. Oswald Mosley? Is it Oswald? Maybe it is. Let's pretend it's Oswald because it probably is. Yeah, it is Oswald Mosley. Yeah. Anyway, so and this is an interesting thing because FDR, if you look at the makeup of his brains trust, you've got guys who are heavy Bolshevik sympathizers, you've got a couple of fascist sympathizers and so on. And what was interesting is there was a lot of agreement in the English-speaking world that we need to pinch ideas from the continental Europeans who are experimenting with new ways to consolidate state power in the economy. And in a way, the ANC is actually very similar to a few things that the German National Socialists did. Whereas what they had is they had companies privatized and then ensured that party cadres got control of the shares for those major strategic companies. And that was the Nazi form of nationalization. And Benito Mussolini very similar. It's like you have a but there was more nationalization initially. So but you also get this in Sweden. They had this Folkhem system that was kind of nationalist, but also kind of socialist, but also not very militaristic, but And so a lot of different parts of the Western world are adopting the same model around this key period of time. And also at the same time, you see the Fabian takeover of the big transatlantic forums, like, Chatham House. What is it? The Institute of International Affairs. I think that's the formal name for Chatham House, really. But it's mainly taken over by the Fabians. It's still very much a Fabian thing. And you've got a South African Institute of International Affairs, which is also worth looking at because they produce a lot of high quality sort of policy commentary and content. They are a branch for South Africa for this network. They put out a lot of commentary and a lot of stuff. So, worth keeping an eye on. And it's very professional. I mean, I think this is one of the things that people forget is, okay, maybe they're your political enemies and they want something different. But it doesn't mean they're not smart and professional and don't have something to say. So, do yourself a favor, and when you have an opportunity, go and peek through their stuff. What was I going to say? Yeah. So when you come across this and you say, oh, well, this looks a lot like fascism in some way, this whole of society approach, it kind of is, but it's on the level of every country controlled by the United States. If you're controlled by the United States, you're going to do all of this kind of stuff. And we may be seeing a reset with the way that Donald Trump is threatening the United Nations with withdrawal or withholding of funds and so on. The United Nations are trying to find a way of generating its own tax revenue by negotiating with the shipping monopoly. Monopsony, I think is the right word. It's like a tiny group of companies that run everything. And yeah, so they're going to try and drag out sort of 12 billion rand out of the shipping industry through some kind of special carbon offset tariff or something. And the Americans don't like this either. So it remains to be seen what's going to come out of this, because if the UN can independently fund itself rather than relying on its member states to drip feed it, then it has greater capacity to push for new policies, redesign policies, get implementation up. But it at this stage is like a self-reinforcing system, because you've got so many of these volunteer elements within various countries that are pushing this stuff. And it's broadly reached, the values that behind it have broadly reached a consensus in the Western world. So the idea that, you're going to get an alternative to this, it requires it to actually be part of the national dialogue, which it's not going to be. There's no way that you actually see people critically engage with this material, partially because it's bloody dull and there's a lot of waffle. And a lot of it sort of sounds nice and doesn't seem particularly harmful, but it's kind of what did Peter Hitchens call it? Marshmallow totalitarianism. It's soft and sticky and it's sweet, but you get stuck in the middle of it nonetheless. And that's kind of the problem, is the DA are a bit like this, and their organizational culture is very cult-like. They don't tolerate any kind of pessimism, any kind of criticism of policies. They don't like internal whistleblowers. They will destroy your life if you blow the whistle internally. They ignore enormous problems. They're not as bad as the ANC. Again, just to say this for the sake of anyone watching this who thinks I've gone off my tree. They're obviously not as bad as the ANC with these problems, but it is bad. And I think that we can do better. So, yeah. On that note, I think we'll say that what the DA has done over here is that they're wasting everyone's time, they're wasting their donors' money, and they're trying to sell global government to the private sector in South Africa, which just seems like, well, what are you doing? What are you actually doing? They're saying, they're offering you really a Faustian bargain. They say, okay, well, we're going to stop we promise you that we'll stop the expropriation of your shares by parasitic members of the ruling party if you can support us. And in exchange, all you have to do is make sure that you implement global governance. And the thing with global governance is that it's expensive. So it creates a lot of job opportunities for like big consultancies. The other thing that it does is it makes it harder for small companies to operate. So then you only have large companies. The DA loves this because large companies reduce the amount of people that you have to negotiate for to have the whole of society approach. So if you only have like a few little sectoral cartels that are all part of the same chambers of commerce, then you don't have to worry about compliance because, they've got a captive market and they'll implement anything they want in exchange for, involvement in policymaking and target setting and so on. Because there's a fair bit of wiggle room in these social development goals. You just have to set a target. As long as you're moving in that direction, kind of a thing. Yeah. And you say, okay, like the UN lacks an enforcement mechanism against any state with halfway decent armed forces. But consider for a moment what international politics looks like. If you're a small country, you don't have to have armed forces. You don't have to not have armed forces. It's not about the armed forces. It's about the fact that the things that you have to do in order to shut off the influence of organizations like the UN and international organizations that are already aligned with them and receiving state funding. Like a lot of the German organizations you find in this country are like this, right? They interfere with your process. Like EarthLife Africa, and all of those organizations in that thing, like green something, green baby shit. I don't know. You have all of these organizations that will use lawfare to block any kind of policy that's in your interest, like the offshore drilling on the West Coast, the coal-fired power plants, the nuclear plants, whatever. These are blocked by German-funded activists, okay? And the thing is, let's say you decide, okay, we've had enough of the meddling NGOs, let's just shut them down. Well, unless you're willing to defend the policy framework and trade policies that are already being favored, right? No, it wasn't Greenpeace. It was some Green Connection. That's their name. But unless you're willing to implement the policies anyway by another mechanism, if you shut down NGOs who are going to meddle with your legal system and your policy formation process, you're going to incur the ire of the United States, who uses these as a mechanism for, keeping an intelligence foothold in your country. You are also going to annoy some activist billionaires who are trying to do things in healthcare and other areas, right? So if you crack down on NGOs, you're also angering a large section of overeducated and underemployed sort of crazy people who will then take to the streets and organize everyone under the sun to go and mess up your government, and you create political instability, and you run the risk of becoming a social pariah or getting weird kinds of pressure and intervention from the United States to topple your government one way or the other, whether it's just by helping rig an election or putting or placing influence on an election, or just running a media campaign that influences public opinion. There's light touch and heavy touch approaches, and you can go all the way up from Orban has mixed success, but I think what's happening with Orban and Poland and so on is that their nationalism is tolerated because they're a frontline state against Russia. Now, this is a comment made by many other people before. It's not my personal insight. This is the idea, is that you're allowed to be a bit nationalist if you're a frontline state. Frontline states being, Israel, Hungary, Poland, Taiwan, Korea used to be like this. I mean, America allowed the PARC regime, very reactionary regime, fantastic drug prohibition policy, by the way. The Koreans, I think, were some of the most subtle because they had traditional hemp farming in South Korea, and they wanted to get rid of marijuana smoking as well, but without impacting the traditional farmers. So they did this thing where they went around identifying the strains that were non-psychoactive and particularly used in agriculture for fiber, and they registered all of these cultivars and these seed lines and everything. And they said, okay, well, you can farm with these, but not these, right? So they kept hemp farming while killing off the cannabis trade in, which I think is brilliant because that's the real benefit of. There are only two benefits to cannabis. Okay, one is the anti-inflammatory chemical CBD, and you can produce cannabis plants that have this, and it's great. It's one of the best anti-inflammatories on the planet. It's fantastic stuff. And then you have the fiber. It's some of the best plant fiber you can get your hands on, and the hippies have been right about this for ages, right? So I think it would be great to copy the Koreans in developing the hemp industry because it's a fantastic cash cow. Almost anyone can grow this stuff, So, yeah, no, but it's a pity. Yeah, but a similar deal with rising nationalism in Japan as a bulwark against China. No, disagree, because Japan is going full on smuts on this whole thing. They're setting up homelands for African immigrants in Japan, and I mean the main business chamber in Japan tried to get the mass immigration stuff happening in 2002. And that initiative has been slowly sitting there in Japan. And the banks wanted to do this in the 1980s. And the central bank deliberately sabotaged Japan's economy by making an overabundance of credit and then pinching them so that they'd have to crash. And the government, the government had, it's a long story, but there's a fantastic book on this called Princes of the Yen. But at any rate, the guy who wrote Princes of the Yen has been interviewed a lot on YouTube recently, so you can go check that out. And there's like a documentary version of the whole thing. But as usual with these things, kind of slow moving and simplified, which is nice actually in a way because you can just sort of tune in and out as you do other things. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah. So no, Japan is they're going woke. They're going woke hard. They're going globalist very hard right now. It's not good, and the right wing is lashing back and so on. But it is what it is. I don't know how far the Trump train is going to go, and I think, judging by what a lot of Americans are thinking, is that this is a temporary reprieve, and when he's gone, it'll be a full relentless onslaught of far left nastiness, and that it's kind of all over. And I mean, my sort of contestation of this is to say that the best solution is actually not to be a state, but to be a sub-state entity in a state with no enforcement capacity. So Solidarity's Anchor Town plan is actually the ideal, but they're not turning it into a hard implemented plan. I'd love to find a way of doing that. I mean, I have sort of some plans, but the difficulty is in getting the organizational capacity behind it to get it done. And I don't know anyone who I can call on to work with because it's like all the major talent has been drawn up into Solidarity and AfriForum already. So, yeah, I don't really know where to begin. But the second an opportunity presents itself, I'm willing to go at it, even if I've only got, half my arse organized. It'd be an interesting experiment. But yeah, so like all of this global planning that I've mentioned, this is kind of what the government's trying to do. And whether they succeed or not is a completely separate question. I think some of it is going to prove impotent, unenforceable, impractical. But this is the idea. These are the ideas. And yeah. By the way, Mr. Lowbrow over there, you're saying the US Constitution is written on cannabis. Cannabis, canvas, and hemp all have the same root. And in Afrikaans, it's the word for a t-shirt is a hemp. Or in Dutch, a hemd with a D. Yeah, the whole thing of building, a canvas is the old word is a genep. And you can get genebis and genvis, and you can see where all these words come from. So, yeah, I mean, like hemp is a great fiber. You can do a lot of stuff with it. But going way off topic, I think I'm a bit too tired to focus. But my general point here is just understand what they're trying to get done, and then ask yourself if you want to put more effort behind, more energy into that effort, or whether you want to do something else. And I think if you're already on this channel watching this kind of thing, you know that you want something different. You want alternative plans. You want rebellious little plans. And basically moving against this is a good idea. Whether or not it's practical to go completely against it and try and say, screw you to the man, is it's difficult. It's difficult to say whether that's, generally speaking, something that small countries can do. And so, yeah, and most countries are small countries, unless you're the United States, the European Union, or China, Russia, and Iran. You're a small country. Unless you're those power blocks, you're a small country, really. And one has to understand how strong one is. And I think the reality is that if you want to stay part of the global system, and the costs for not being a member are enormous. If you want to stay part of the global system, you're going to have to comply. So it's a very difficult game to play. And it's very depressing. But from my perspective, we are entering a period in which arbitraging for these policies with countries like China and Russia, without going fully under their wing, may be a possibility going forward, if we're lucky. But that requires people who are dedicated, cautious, serious, and understand that national sovereignty isn't a given or an absolute or easy to get or something that's even possible if you're really tiny. And the little bits crumbs that you can pick up are small. But at the same time, I think what we need to do is we need to have a realistic perspective on this, and say that this is the goal, and we can get this much of the goal if we're really clever, but we don't want to force ourselves to be completely vassalized, because that's just miserable. And it's a sensible, pragmatic approach. That's what I kind of want to hope. And don't buy the DA's bullshit. Anyway, night.